Bennett was in his 8th year as Premier, but was already thinking he was going to step down that term, as indeed he did. The one thing that Bennett didn't allow for in his thinking, or at least wasn't able to manage, was he forgot that one of the reasons his father didn't step down was because his father's great rivalry, W.A.C. Bennett's great rival for leader of the Social Credit Party, was a wild man populist, Phil Ghilardi from Kamloops. And the old man stayed in part because he felt if he stepped down that the party would be handed over to Ghilardi. And you don't want a wild man populist ruling British Columbia. So Bill thinks he's got this box. Vander Zalm is out of politics. Vander Zalm is busy developing Fantasy Garden World, and surely he wouldn't dare to come back to provincial politics. Oh, really? Vander Zalm was getting ready to announce he wasn't running for the Social Credit Party leadership in the spring of '86, and on the way to the press conference he talked himself out of it and announced he was running. And he won the leadership, with the consequences we know. Those of us who've covered Vander Zalm over the years are accused of dwelling excessively on Bill Vander Zalm's stories because they're so unparalleled by anybody else, and I guess I'm as guilty of that as anyone. I've certainly lived off the avails of Vander Zalm coming and going. And no doubt we'll mention a couple of Vander Zalm stories during this presentation as they come up. One of my favorites is when the Health Ministry commissioned a video, this was in the days before DVDs, a video to educate school students in the use of condoms. This was early in the AIDS scare, and it was thought a good idea if teenagers had some notion what this was all about. Vander Zalm refused to allow the video to be distributed into the schools in BC because he said it was, quote, one long condom ad. The message, he said, is, I want to have sex, but I don't want to die. And I ask you, who doesn't? In the press gallery, we made up a little Motown song on this line. Listen up, people, it ain't no lie. I want to have sex, but I don't want to die. Regrettably, couldn't get anybody to record it. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of Vander Zalm stories, but since this is a summary, in early 1991, Vander Zalm's own political party turns on him and basically forces him out of office. This story is another one of those examples where British Columbia is unique. Most places you change leaders by either the leader deciding it's time to retire, Bill Bennett, or elections. With Vander Zalm, you had the makings of a coup d'etat. The Social Credit Caucus, with some of the country's leading constitutional experts, and the cooperation of the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, David Lamb, drew up the paperwork for the government caucus to fire the Premier and replace the Premier with somebody else without an election. It would have been constitutional, it would have stood up, paperwork was all done. The morning they were going to put it all in motion, Vander Zalm resigned. The guy who has all the paperwork, I keep reminding him that before he dies, he's got to send it all to the provincial archive. He's keeping it. He doesn't want to put it in the archive until all the players are gone and it won't be controversial anymore. But you never know. That might come in handy someday somewhere else, right? How to fire a Premier without an election. British Columbia, as with so many other things, we are precedent setting. Vander Zalm's replaced by Rita Johnson, first woman Premier in the history of British Columbia. Is brought in to clean up somebody else's mess, big surprise to women. Johnson, you look, I mean, the hand she was dealt, there was no playing that to a win. She was gone, defeated in the election. I still hear from Johnson, really tough woman, had some very good qualities. She's involved in the effort to revive the Conservative Party in British Columbia. She's one of the advisors to them. So she's still active. She lives in Vernon, an absolutely terrific poker player. She took a whistle-stop tour of British Columbia in the one election campaign she ran in, through the Caribou and the old BC Rail, remember it? The BC Rail had a heritage train, and they chartered the heritage train, and the Premier announced that everyone was welcome to her car for a poker game. And she proceeded to clean the lot of us out in about half an hour. She's a formidable poker player. She took me for 50 bucks in my first hand, and I went back and forth over whether or not to claim it on expenses, and I finally decided, nah, it's not really business, right? It was an important learning experience, but it wasn't really business. Johnson's gone, in comes Mike Harcourt. Now, Harcourt's an interesting guy, and I mean, he did some very important things, moved us forward in a way we needed to move, dealing with First Nations in particular, brought us to kind of a modern day understanding of land use planning in the province. I recommend still to people that they read Harcourt's book, partly because it has a chapter in it that is one of the most vicious things you'll ever read about the provincial news media, and it's worth reading. But the real interesting thing about Harcourt's book is a number of times Harcourt tells you in the book that he wanted to do this or he wanted to do that and the party wouldn't let him. It's an astonishingly candid book on the subject of Mike Harcourt being the leader of the NDP and the premier, but not really controlling that party, and never really being 100% in charge of the government. And toward the end of the book, in the middle of the Nanaimo bingo scandal, and if you've got a couple of hours, I'll tell you what all that one was about, along with the BC Rail case, which Harcourt had nothing to do with, Harcourt suggests to the party a way out of the problem, and they reject his solution. They won't do what he says, and so he quits. And he tells you that on his last day in office, the word out of the BC Federation of Labour was that I had to go. So that's an interesting story about the NDP and about Harcourt. And Harcourt's gone, in comes Glenn Clark. Clark's a very, very bright guy. And he very quickly establishes a decisive, driving image that is quite different from Harcourt. We're now up to Clark taking over in early '96. So Van der Zem 86, Johnson 91, Harcourt 91, late 91. Clark takes over in '96, puts in this very, very decisive look, and calls an election, which he wins very, very narrowly. It's one of those elections that we have every now and then in the first past the post system where one party gets the most votes, that was the Liberals, but one party, because its votes distributed more evenly around the province. The political scientists say the vote is more efficient. Some of you may not associate that with the NDP's record in office, but in any event, they win the election, and Clark takes the most seats. Morning after the election, Glenn Clark says, "I'm humbled. I said he'll get over it." Which he did very, very quickly. For a very bright guy, who was a very quick study and a good speaker, his great vice, I think, was a tendency to confuse press releases with policy and promises with action. One of the moments that stands out most for me, everybody remembers the fast ferries, and they were going to be on budget and right down to the toilet paper and all that and stuff. One of the ones that really struck me was he got up at a party convention and promised to build 3 aluminum smelters. Not one, not 2, 3 aluminum smelters. And he turned to the press table and he said, 3, count them, 3 aluminum smelters. I dare Conrad Black to print that. So Black owned the paper in those days. And I thought to myself, I don't know Mr. Black personally, but I think I can arrange for one of his newspapers to print that. So we printed it. Glenn Clark promises 3 aluminum smelters. Well, let the records show that he delivered no, count them, 0 aluminum smelters. And his whole time is characterized by that, of overreaching, over-promising, overselling, fighting elections every day as if, you know, every day was election day. And then he got into this stupid casino licensing thing. And on that one, the best read on the scandal that forced Clark out is the Conflict of Interest Commissioner's report. Because what he says basically is, you know, this sort of, the tone of it is an aged uncle, and H.A.D. Oliver, who wrote the report, was in his 80s when he wrote it. An aged uncle sort of expressing disappointment in a nephew who just kind of, if only you'd come and talked to me beforehand, you never would have done this. And it's true. Clark was doubly guilty of conflict of interest. He was charged and acquitted.